Good morning and welcome wherever you are dialing in today with us, and welcome to the San Diego Museum of Art Guest Lecture Series. This is brought to you today by the docents of the San Diego Museum of Art. Today's lecture is Planning Wonders, SDMA's 2024 exhibition on science and Islamic art. But before I begin, I want to remind you that during the lecture, you will be able to ask questions of our speaker in the Zoom chat function. And those questions and comments will be curated by Mary Grillo as part of the question and answer portion of Dr. Akbarnia's talk.
You must be muted again, B. Can't hear you.
Okay. Where do I need to start? Okay, I got it.
You're good now.
I can hear Phyllis. Yeah, okay.
Start over.
Should we start over? Okay, I will. David, you're, all right, good morning. And welcome wherever you are to the San Diego Museum of Art Guest Lecture Series, brought to you today by the docents of San Diego Museum of Art. Today's lecture is Planning Wonders, SDMA's 2024 exhibition on science and Islamic art. But before I begin, I want to remind you that you can ask questions of our speaker in the chat, in the Zoom chat function, which is, you pick it up at the bottom and the questions get answered over here. Mary Grillo, our docent Mary Grillo, will be curating those Q&As and will ask those questions in the Q&A section after Dr. Akbarnia's talk. And following the lecture today, there will also be a virtual tour led by our own David Miles, who will be leading a tour to share with us the wonders of science and art in our own SDMA collection. I want to take a moment to thank all the individuals who make up this series appear so seamless, although there was a little hitch there, seamless, and that's David Miles, Mary Grillo, Marilyn Woods, and Dr. Jim Grebel. My name is B. Barraza, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome today's speaker, San Diego Museum of Art's own Ladan Akbarnia. Dr. Akbarnia is the curator of South Asian and Islamic art at SDMA and a specialist on the art of medieval Iran and Central Asia. She received her Ph.D. in art and architecture from Harvard University. Before coming to San Diego, Ladan served as curator and assistant keeper of the Islamic collections at the British Museum, where she was one of the lead curators of the Al-Bukhari Foundation Gallery of the Islamic World. Previously, she was Hagop Kevorkian, associate curator of Islamic art at the Brooklyn Museum, where along with curating and reinstallation of the Islamic collection, she acquired and collected that gallery's first collections of works in Middle Eastern contemporary art. Her research and interests include cross-cultural transmissions and oral traditions in the art of the Islamic world, East Asia and South Asia, as well as issues of display in global museums. And today, we are going to be the lucky recipients of her vast experience, creativity, wit, and wisdom. Dr. Akbarnia will be giving us a glimpse into the Getty Foundation's initiative, Pacific Standard Time 2024, which is focused on the intersection of art and science. It's a collaboration of exhibitions and programs throughout Southern California. And SDMA is one of the funded research grants in round one of the grant-making process. It gives me great pleasure to turn the screen over to Dr. Akbarnia as she shares her insights into the planning of SDMA's ambitious, amazing contribution to Pacific Standard Time 2024.
Thank you so much, Bea, and thank you to all of the docents for inviting me in the first place. And to everyone for being so patient with this process. This is actually my first sort of bigger Zoom public lecture. You know, it's not a conversation. I mean, it will be a conversation later, which is a format I'm much more comfortable with. So I would much rather be there in person with you, but I hope that it won't be long. Oh, I see my family as well. And my children watching from my parents' house. So I know that we don't have a lot of time. I also know that I tend to speak rather quickly. So if I do, David or B, could we have, well, there's no way that I'll know, I think. I'll just do my best to speak slowly, but just come off mute if it's going at, you know, turbo speed. How is it right now? It's okay? Just, okay. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. And do what David told me to do, which is to minimize. Okay, so it should play from start. Okay, here we go. Title slide. It's very strange not seeing anybody. Planning Wonders, SDMA's 2024 exhibition on science and Islamic art. So this talk is going to be, it's going to be about this exhibition, Wonders of Creation, Art, Science, and Innovation in the Islamic World, which is being planned for summer of 2024. So you're going to get a preview of this exhibition in its current form. These things can change, it's still early days. But I was asked to also talk a bit also about how this is part of how, it's almost like this is a case study for exhibition planning in museums. And so I will talk a little bit about that as well. If I go in too far in one direction or the other, that's definitely what the Q&A is for, and I'm happy to expand however I can on questions. I'll then, Bee's touched on this, but I will come back to the Getty's role in this project. And then I'll go through the exhibition itself, its genesis, how we are developing it, what the scope and theme and questions are. And then the longest part of today's talk is going to be focused on the exhibition narrative and structure, because it's very hard to just kind of fly through all these images. And I also wanted to give you a lot of eye candy. And finally, one of the exciting aspects of this exhibition is to be thinking about art commissions that we will be proposing for the show, and then to the Q&A. So for those of you who may not know what Pacific Standard Time is, especially if anybody's listening from abroad, the Getty Foundation has an initiative called PST, Pacific Standard Time, which is basically collaboration between cultural institutions or institutions across Southern California that propose, and then if they're successful, get grants from the Getty Foundation to pursue projects so that they can participate in a particular theme. So in 2024, it's going to be the intersections of art and science in a global dimension. So it's called Art times Science times LA. And it doesn't have to be focused on LA. And then you meet other people who are grantees. And it's really this unusual opportunity to be invited to test ideas that might flop completely. And so some of these things, they reach fruition as exhibitions, some become film programs, some are publications. But the point is, you're allowed and given this opportunity to just not be afraid to go out on a limb and just risk whatever you want and to think big. And so I really thank Anita Feldman for our head of curatorial affairs, deputy director for curatorial affairs and education at the museum, and of course to our director Roxana Velasquez as well, for just saying, just have a blank sheet of paper and think big, but come up with an idea for an exhibition that can fit into this theme. Could be geometry or another kind of science. And so I will point out before I go to the next slide that there isn't one other museum that's doing a very focused Islamic themed project, and that's the Museum of Jurassic Technology in Culver City in Los Angeles. And there we're going to be focusing on geometric ornament in architecture And we'll be looking at some similar elements. So I would personally love to be able to even have drawings from what they will be building, because they'll have an immersive experience rather than object-based, to see if we can kind of collaborate that way. But after thinking, that first part of coming up with an exhibition idea is, it could be that you've just acquired this fantastic collection of items that they could be all books, or maybe it's somebody who has bequeathed a collection. And those can all be reasons to exhibit something, or they can be a part of an idea that you've been developing for years. I kind of like ideas that come out of a certain type of parameters where you're told you got to do something within these boundaries, because in some ways I almost feel like it prevents me from going too crazy without any structure. So once you start generating these ideas, like for me, it was about looking at different texts, looking at objects. And I kept coming back to this one text, which then became the inspiration for the title. And then from there, it kind of built up this idea of the wonders of creation, and thinking about the wonders of human creation. So I will get to that in a second more specifically. But once you do come up with this idea, because I am meant to be talking about planning an exhibition, you want to start building a bibliography. Summers are great for that. Fellows are great for that. My graduate fellow, Sandy, was brilliant in helping me start a checklist. And when you do that, it's a great time to collect images, build files for the objects themselves, so you can gather research, especially during COVID. We've had to do a lot of digital work. And then to build files for the lenders that you're going to be approaching to request loans from, and artist files for contemporary artists. And then talking internally to to the team that will be working on the exhibition with you about what are the exhibition ideas going to be. Who is our audience here in San Diego? That's an audience that I'm getting to know and increasingly being here. What do we want? What are the kinds of things that are important to the museum right now? We'd really like to be tapped into our greater community, and to also be looking at areas that we haven't looked at before. So one of the ways to really try and do that is to build a great, especially if you're not a specialist. I'm not a specialist in the history of science. I am a specialist I specialize in Islamic world, but I may know a lot about Iran or Central Asia, but not know so much about North Africa. So or not know about astrolabes. So that's why I'm building up this great group of advisors from different institutions, and then they will help through workshops and reading text to make sure that we sort of do our due diligence. And one of the people who will be involved also in that sense, in an advisory capacity, is the director of the History of Science Museum in Oxford, which is actually one of the institutions that I found very inspirational, and because they are really also trying to look again at how we even look at material culture in general, and how we blur these boundaries, just as I'm trying to do with this project about between art and science. And then you always have to apply for more funding. And to do that, you need to build a budget, a timeline. I'm really grateful to all the people involved with that, especially our grants manager who's been really helping, and my boss, of course, and our CFO who's had to constantly look at these budgets. So what did we come up with? What's the impact we want to have, and what is the scope of this exhibition? It will be a major exhibition, a large-scale exhibition, so we want to try to accomplish a lot. I just want to do a little check that the pace is okay. If maybe David could just pop on and say something, or B.
Yep, that's good.
Okay, great. Okay,
Thank you.
The scope is, the idea is basically to investigate. I forget that I have sometimes a few notes, and then I forget to look at them. So first of all, why Wonders of Creation? This was, the title was inspired by surviving folios of the Kitab Ajaib al-Makhluqat va Gharaib al-Mawjudat, which means the Book of Wonders of Creation and Oddities of Existence. And you'll see this on another slide soon, which was widely translated 13th century cosmology by the Iranian Arab polymath al-Qazvini. And so I've been thinking about this show as kind of a way of exploring the wonders of creation created by human beings over time in in the Islamic world. So we want to investigate, as the theme of the Ph.D. initiative also is asking, intersections, not necessarily, I'm not calling it Islamic science with art, because what is Islamic science? And why are we saying Islamic science but not Christian science or European science? So I think it's the idea is to look at this and look at how Islamic thought, philosophy, whether faith or thought or politics or or intellect, how that engaged with science and visual and material culture in the Islamic world from the 7th century, which was the advent of Islam, to today, and to examine the impact that that's had on global civilization, especially in the sense of artistic production. And through this wide range of material, through techniques, media, and representing countries from Spain to Southeast Asia and the diaspora, to show diversity through the over 100 or 150 works that we'll include. And those works could be as small as coins, or as very tiny scientific instruments, to grand architectural designs or installations by contemporary artists. And the idea is to also blur these boundaries between art and science. What is art and what is science? And part of the first section of the exhibition will sort of focus on that. And then throughout, to illuminate or shed light on the agents or so-called makers of visual culture. I did not realize that I did not have my battery plugging in. To emphasize the agents or makers of visual culture, who could be the artists and craftsmen, but also scientists, philosophers, mathematicians, patrons, and more. And this was inspired really by the really wonderful work that my colleague Blair Anderson at the University of Edinburgh has been doing. She's writing a monograph on this 9th century polymath from Andalusia, southern Spain, Islamic Spain, called Ibn Firnas, who was a courtly figure, who was a scientist, but also a poet, and he was a very cultured individual. And she's really arguing for the idea for us to look at these scientists as makers of visual culture. So I feel like I want to apply that across the board to all these participants in the creation of what we see and what we look at that's cultural. And to do this, because there's so many different disciplines also, we need to have an interdisciplinary approach. So our board has people who specialize in Indo-Persian literature, Persian literature, Arab literature and history, early period, later period, science, occult sciences. So it's just across the board. And I'd really like to have people who focus regionally also in areas that have not been as represented. And ultimately all of that will also help us to reach both locally diverse audiences and globally as well. And I think we're beyond the time where we won't consider how to reach people virtually. And then what are the questions that are informing our narrative? So one right up off the bat is, what is Islamic science? And what disciplines fall under this umbrella? And all of these, and what are the scientific discoveries or these technological innovations that transformed artistic production in the Islamic world, and what are their legacies today? And we'll see that especially in the work of contemporary artists, but not just. And how does modern science help us understand Islamic visual culture more? And we'll see where conservation science plays a role. And so the exhibition is thus addressing Islam, science, and material culture as agents in our endeavor to know the world, both intellectually and also materially, and to preserve our shared heritage. And so that's sort of the message that will come at the end. Okay. So let's go ahead and delve into the actual narrative of the exhibition. So you're going to get familiar with this little outline. I'll keep coming back to it. I'll go through intro and part one first and then come back to it. But the extensive breadth and depth of content in this exhibition are going to be, the best way to address them, I felt, was through a thematic framework rather than trying to create this timeline going straight through it. It didn't make sense. And each of these thematic sections will also be enhanced by sub-themes. So the themes are really following the idea of beginning with the wonders of creation. So that's in the introduction, just being introduced to the show by the namesake for the title, because it's a play on that exhibition title to emphasize the humanizing element of artistic production by Muslim and other makers. Because there are writers and polymaths that are included in the show who were Christian or were not Muslim necessarily, but were participating in this Islamic context. And another theme is, of course, the intersection of art, science, and Islamic discourse throughout, scientific processes and technologies. So that's really part 2, innovations in the image. And then these themes will collectively illuminate the impact of Islam, science, and material culture on artistic production, and also on our intellectual and material knowledge of our shared world, as I mentioned before. But there will also be a number of sub-themes, one of which I've put up on this slide called Figures in Focus, which will kind of run throughout the show. I always like the idea of having these stable ways of taking people through the show, but always knowing that you're going to get throughout these little points where you'll get, oh, I'm going to learn about this historical figure, or who is that? Or why was the physician so important in the Islamic world? And so these will come up, and my idea is that they would be sort of branded similarly, either around an object, or there would be more some graphic way of like a graphic design that shows them. But that will allow us to get to know who these makers of visual culture are. So we definitely want to have an example of each kind, like a scientist, a physician, a craftsman, a contemporary artist. And that way we're arguing again that no matter what they were, whether scientists, intellectuals, philosophers, patrons, that they all were makers, and that the impact, and also to look at the impact of Islamic science on contemporary practice as well. And ending with the last part was looking at modern, conservation science and how that helps us preserve, understand, and be able to better preserve Islamic heritage. So now I'm taking you in if my wish list, if I could get whatever I want, then I'd love to be able to borrow these pages from the Metropolitan Museum, because they're a very courtly example of the frontispiece or the front opening pages of a book, which happens to be a copy of Hazvini's Wonders of Creation. And if you look at it closely, or you zoom in on it, you'll see like this really rich use of gold that's been used for it. So you'll sort of open the exhibition the way that you would open a book. The idea is to evoke this anticipation and excitement about the rest of the exhibition, much like encountering a long-awaited book that you've been waiting for. And so you'll see this double-page frontispiece from a 15th century copy produced in Shiraz, of an Arabic copy, even though it's produced in Iran, and really richly illuminated in lapis blue and gold with elephants, rhinoceroses, tigers, dragons, which my daughter will love, and phoenixes that appear in medallions. And the pages will immediately hint at the riches to be found in subsequent rooms. But I will say that this show will not just be about, courtly art. It's really going to be about both that and objects of daily use as well, because science it permeated all levels of society. And then once you move beyond this, you see the pages from the text that actually, for me, were the reason why I built the show in this way, or conceived the show in this way. Pages from the British Library's copy of the Wonders of Creation, which is attributed to about 1300 and possibly in Mosul, Iraq. And these early paintings are also ones that don't have like this very fully developed back. There's a lot you can talk about in terms of classical traditions and borrowing from Greek and classical artistic traditions. And this is important because part of the first part of this exhibition is to talk about, when we go into the next section, about this early phase of knowledge being disseminated in the Islamic world that had pre-existed Islam. So moving beyond the exhibition's so-called opening pages, Viewers will then enter a space that provides them, and again, this is how I'm conceiving it right now, it could change. They'll enter a space that provides them with a substantial historical framework to understand Islam and the sciences and material culture that are associated with Islamic discourses. So early interactions that illustrate the translation, adaptation, and mediation of classical scientific treatises will be illustrated by a page, the very top left hand side here. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but I'm pointing to this image of this figure sitting there. This is showing a physician creating an elixir from an illustrated Arabic manuscript of Dioscorides' Materia Medica, which was possibly made in Baghdad and dated to 1224. And it's one of the oldest, and then right below it is one of the oldest surviving copies of al-Sufi's 10th century treatise, the Book of Constellations of the Fixed Stars, which apparently advanced the 2nd century discussions of Ptolemy in his Almagest through depictions of the 48 classical constellations in mirror image, juxtaposing their appearances so that you're getting both the view from Earth and from the skies. And these will be exhibited in the same space with objects. This is why I have this whole array of works here that illustrate horoscopes, including an Indian star map or star chart, astrolabes from Iran, Yemen, Ottoman Turkey, you know, if you can get these. When I'm choosing objects, also another point of like exhibition planning is I'm always trying to get a nice balance of regions once the anchors are the ones I've chosen. And of course, in the end, it will all depend on what our final list is, how the narrative takes what course it takes ultimately. And then there'll be, there's a jade cup that's inscribed with the name of the 15th century Timurid prince, patron, and astronomer Ulugh Beg. This is coming from the British, this is at the British Museum. I'm not sure we can get it, but I would love to be able to get it. And these were believed to ward off poison. And then there are works that introduce medicine, astronomy, more astronomy and astrology, philosophy, geography, cartography. You can see all these that I've included on the slide. These will start answering that question, what is Islamic science? And again, pointing out that the works will reflect both courtly tastes as well as show objects that are used daily. There's a medicinal jar to the right here. I've included a beautiful necklace that's at the British Museum. If I'm going back to the British Museum a lot, it's because I know this collection, but there are certain techniques used with jewelry that are also that really, I feel, have a place in this show. On top of that, the mineralogy that's involved. And as a group, these will seek to answer this question, what is Islamic science? In case anybody doesn't know, so now looking a little closer at the medicine, for if there are any people in the medical profession in the audience, I know there are at least 2 at my house, at my parents' house. These are manuscripts that all are addressing issues about medicine. So the page that I talked about before by Dioscorides, that comes from the Dioscorides Materia Medica. For those who don't know who that is, this was a text that was originally composed in Cilicia by the 1st century BC Greek physician Dioscorides, or Pausanias Dioscorides. And it was a medical treatise that would later which was first translated from Greek into Syriac after Dioscorides wrote it. And then the person who translated it into Syriac then made another edition into Arabic. And then that became the version that was disseminated the most widely throughout the world into Persian and other languages. And I just go through that to just show you how much knowledge is being transferred, but then going through, it's like telephone, but it's not always being translated directly. Sometimes it's being added to, or it could be something like Ibn Sina or Avicenna, the sort of world's most famous doctor, a physician, one could say, who would, I should be following my notes here, who brought together knowledge that other knowledge and then presented it as an edited volume himself. So in this case, it's a handbook of medicine in 5 volumes. This is the 5th volume, and it's at the Aga Khan Museum in Toronto, Canada. And Ibn Sina or Avicenna was an 11th century scholar, and he started another thing that's important, and this is why I come back to Islamic discourse. He started his learning by memorizing and learning the Quran. And then from there, by the age of, I don't know, it's not 10, he memorized the Quran. I think a few years after that, he was a doctor. And then he ended up, this particular volume is about, it's on compound drugs and pharmaceuticals, but he then goes on to produce other types of scientific texts as well on mathematics, astronomy, metaphysics, music, and poetry as well. I won't spend any more time on the others, but each of these brings you another scientist, and there are books on anatomy or on health that hopefully we'll be able to have a nice array of to show. How am I with time? This is definitely the longest section. But because depending on how much time we have, I'll sort of go through these quickly. I'm just focusing on some of the works that I really love. This particular piece, it's called the Horoscope or Kitab al-Wiladat of Iskandar Sultan ibn Omar Sheikh, who was a Timurid prince of a Turkic line of rulers and who ruled over Iran and Central Asia in the 15th century, especially. And this was compiled for his birth in Shiraz, Iran, in the 9th century, 813 AH, or the Hijri year, or that's about 1411 on the Gregorian calendar. And it's in the Wellcome Library in London. It's going to be on view at an exhibition called Epic Iran at the Victoria and Albert Museum in a few weeks. And this was made for this prince, who was the grandson of the ruler, Turco-Mongol ruler Timur, who some may know as Tamerlane. And these folios belong to a section of a nativity book and horoscope that was compiled by his court astrologer and was once part of a larger anthology of texts that were housed in his library. And so in addition to containing the astrological observations about his conception, present, and future, the horoscope represents also his intellectual interest in astronomy and astrology. Along with Iskandar Sultan, another Timurid prince and grandson of Timur was the Timurid prince Ulugh Beg, who was based for much of his life. There were a lot of these principalities under the Timurids after Timur himself died and his son after him. And Ulugh Beg was stationed for a long time in Samarkand. He was a mathematician and astronomer. He was a great patron of architecture, and he founded an observatory at Samarkand. This jade cup is inscribed with his name, and it's it was in whether or not it was his or not. It's a very interesting object that I've written about elsewhere, but it's an important piece because it's also made of jade, and just as in China, in Central Asia and the Iranian world, jade was believed to have these talismanic qualities in both post-Mongol and Central Asia. And there's also Chinese inspiration in the handle. There's also then, you can see that it was important over time. It was in Ottoman hands because the repair on it has an Ottoman inscription. And it just tells you a lot about the journey some of these objects took and what value they held based on what their association was with them. But jade is also important, and it gives us a chance to not only focus on Ulugh Beg as a patron and somebody who was also an astronomer and a mathematician, but also then to look at the text of someone like the 11th century polymath al-Biruni, who wrote a whole treatise on minerals. Sometimes there will be objects that kind of feel like they're out of left field, and those I think are the best. This was on sale several months ago, and I have to find out what collection it ended up in, because I'd love to borrow this star map, which shows the northern and southern celestial hemispheres. It's inscribed in Devanagari, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, with the names of the constellations. And it was made in Jaipur, India, around 1780. This is based on the ruler he's associated with. And it's on paper, ink and opaque watercolor with gold. And it's a rare star map or chart that's distinguished by this unusual superimposition of the 27 lunar mansions in Hindu astronomy over depictions of the zodiac and constellations known in Western astronomy. And I have to read this because I can never remember all of it, but the printed star map tradition recalls Albrecht Dürer's woodcut star maps of 1515 and alludes to the Jesuit missions that introduced European woodcuts, as many of you will know, especially for the San Diego collection, and alludes who came along with woodcuts and prints and Christianity to Mughal India and contributed to this convergence of Christian European, Perso-Islamic and indigenous Hindu artistic tradition in India. And the map is associated on stylistic grounds with India's great patron of astronomy, the Maharaja Jai Singh II, who ruled in the 18th century, first half. And he was the Hindu ruler of Amber and Jaipur and served as a vassal to the Muslim Mughal emperors. So sometimes we're looking at a general context in which people who are not necessarily Muslim are also participating, and there are these layerings of traditions with others, which is always the case. It's never a vacuum. And some astrolabes, I'll kind of go quickly through these because it's hard for me to explain how an astrolabe works, but I will say that a couple of these are from the History of Science Museum. I wanted to show an example of a spherical one. The second one from the left, the first flat one, is believed to be, it's the oldest complete gear device in the world, and it was made in Isfahan by, and we know the maker's name. And the one next to it is unique in being the only astrolabe to illustrate all 28 lunar mansions. And I've included the other one from the Met because it was made in Yemen. So again, trying to find, this middle one is from Ottoman Turkey, this is Iran, and that's Eastern Islamic lands. It could be a couple places, could be Iraq, it could be Iran, to show you that the wider range. But it's still Central Islamic lands. I'd like to push further. And then finally, among these, the last piece I'll show in this section is an example of the so-called occult sciences or forbidden sciences, which many people who study the field have issues with that, have it being called that. Now, this really interesting instrument is in the collection of the British Museum, and it has its own special case now in the permanent gallery. So it probably is very hard for it to travel. But it is an example of the science of geomancy, or the science of the sand, which was a popular form of divination where you seek knowledge from the supernatural. And one of the inscriptions on it, I've included the translation for here, which says, "The judicious one hides his secret thoughts, but I disclose them just as if hearts were created as my parts." Moving on, the next section will really be about the scientific processes. And the technologies, so if the first section were about learning the text and the people, the actors and the sources, the next section is about things that are more active, the movement, the innovation, and then the effect that had on later artistic production. So through this, hopefully a dynamic selection of works that illustrates science as process, Wonders of Creation will delve now into the extraordinary innovations in science and technology that were introduced to and by the Islamic world. So paper is one of them, but it was not introduced by the Islamic world. It was introduced to the Islamic world by China in the 8th century. And showing, when we can, their transformative impact on Islamic visual culture over time. And a lot of that will also be seen in the work of contemporary works. And some of the examples in this section, and so we'll see artists represented from the Middle East, Central and South Asia, the diaspora, hopefully North Africa as well. And examples of technologies that will be addressed here would be luster technology, marble decoration, lithograph printing, printed books, and then artists who actually use new methods that look back to older types of crafts. So these are some of the kinds of works that you could see in this section. And also here, we'll look at a little more at mathematics and geometry, especially with respect to architecture, and also looking a bit more at the role of the people who were building. What was their knowledge of the math? What was their knowledge of these formulas? I will just point out that this work right here is by an artist, a Saudi artist known as Ahmed Matar, who has done these works where he uses X-rays. Well, he's actually his background is as a doctor, and then he's moved now more fully into the arts. And you may recognize our Spanish luster plate from the Binney collection that's here at the SDMA. So first known in Iraq, from Iraq in the 8th to 9th centuries, inspiration for the development of luster technology may have come from luster-stained glass produced in Byzantine workshops in Egypt. The movement of potters traveling with the secrets of their trade may have played a role in the technique's transmission then from Egypt to Iran and Spain in the 11th and 12th centuries. I've done a masterpiece minute on this plate to the right that's in, oh my goodness, it has the wrong caption. Just ignore the everything, everything, the earthenware is correct, but it's the San Diego collection. And this basically we show through through this movement and transferring of knowledge. By the 15th century, the technique was practiced in Italy, where it underwent a revival in the 19th century, eventually reaching Britain as well. And I talked a bit about how it ends up, how this really took off in Spain as well. So I will just ask you to listen to the Masterpiece Minute so you get a full take on this technology in Spain. So therefore, you basically see a glass bowl made in the 11th to 12th century of Egypt, a stone paste ceramic dish, which is a much finer ceramic dish than earthenware, made in 14th century Iran, and then this earthenware charger made in Spain, all illuminating this transmission of luster technology across media, time, and space. We'll also see this we'll look at this with marbling, and we have some examples in our collection of marbled paper as well, and looking at how this technique traveled in the Persianate world, Iran, and in India. So our example is the right-hand folio of this double-page album, and I'm grateful to Jake Benson for sending me the image of the friar. This we unfortunately won't be able to borrow because the Friar Gallery at the Smithsonian Institution, the stipulation for those works are that they have to stay there, but I thought it would be nice to show them together. And this is a work that I found when we were applying for funding from the Getty, that's in the Getty collection. And I just thought it was interesting because it just is an example of a work that was compiled, an album compiled by a military attaché of the Holy Roman Emperor, Rudolph II's embassy to the Ottoman court. And so the papers in this album most likely came from the covered bazaar in Istanbul and exhibit this marbled paper technique. And then recently, I have many brilliant colleagues working on the wonders of creation just itself as a trope. And they, and a couple of people working on lithographed examples in particular. The one on the right, BL, stands for the British Library, and the one on the left at the McGill Library in Canada are both from the same printing press in Lucknow, the Munshi Nawal Kishore press. And these, I found kind of the same, they're the same page where they're talking about. And I think one's in Urdu, the other one, I feel like it might be in Persian, but I'm not sure, but this one is in Urdu. And then a work by Sadegh, the late wonderful Sadegh Tirafkan, an Iranian artist who used 3 units of lithographed Shahnameh units to create a curtain going over him. And he was making a comment also on the loss of tradition, but lithograph technology actually signified in some ways the loss of the manuscript tradition in Iran. So I thought that would be a nice piece as well. And then we go on to innovations and the image. This continuing with this, taking it into math, the mathematics and Muqarnas. So there have been there are certain, when I was at Harvard, another student there who was a physicist, he popularized, it has been part of this recent groundbreaking discovery by scientists that concerns the aperiodic patterned gireh tiles and introduces the possibility that 12th century Iranian craftsmen already understood quasi-crystalline patterns in architecture once believed to have been identified by modern Western scientists in the 1970s. I am now trying to find examples of this type of tile to include in the show, because I thought that was really exciting to look to have evidence of knowledge, of practice that was much earlier, centuries earlier than we thought. But that is not something I have, but I just felt like I needed to mention that. And it's also taken a long time to try to figure out exactly what that all means, not having a science background. But I can talk to you about Muqarnas, which is this architectural unit, a three-dimensional unit that is sometimes also referred to as stalactite or honeycomb vaulting, where you have this type of shape all stacked up and in some cases building a vault or a dome, as in one example in medieval, it's not the earliest, in Iran, in the shrine of Abd al-Samad in Natan. So that's about early 14th century. But this has been something that has really inspired people over time and centuries. So you can see here that an Iranian artist, or Iranian origin artist, German-Iranian based in Berlin, Timo Nasseri, has taken that design of Muqarnas and just really worked it onto a work on paper that's in the collection of the British Museum, and created this beautiful piece through this Muqarnas design. And then he explodes it out in a mirror into 3 dimensions with mirror work. And mirror work is also an Iranian tradition, a craft tradition in Iran, that is something that was really beloved to the late Munir Farmayan, one of whose works I show above. And a lot of her work deals with numerology, brings in, ideas about Sufism and a lot of metaphysics comes in here as well. So this section will allow us to explore that as well. And then finally, we get to the end, which is looking at the role of science today. On the one hand, it might seem, well, why are we looking at that? What does that have to do with Islamic visual culture? Well, it's because we're using it to be able to understand Islamic visual culture. So this is what happens when you sort of talk and you don't look down at your notes, but I just want to make sure that I'm not forgetting anything. In this section, an important aspect of this exhibition will be explored in this final section, which will consider the conservation and cultural preservation techniques that are used today in museums and in the cultural sector, and how these can be used within a global museum or museum that represents global civilizations to preserve the heritage it has, that it's protecting. So with the participation of colleagues that I worked with previously at the British Museum, or even just sharing the knowledge that we learned in previous projects when we were doing, preparing the galleries of Islamic culture at the Islamic World at the British Museum, we would be able to hopefully show a bowl like this one that you see to the right, which tells you, it's connected to a very famous potter named Abu Zaid, and it was found through looking at, which happens a lot with these pieces, it was found to be composed of many different fragments. And this could happen contemporaneously, and other pieces would be from the same time period would be used to build it up, or it could be done in the 20th century, at which point they could also do the overpainting. And we decided after we saw this, you could see all the different pieces, to keep the painting on the inside and not take the piece apart, but to take off the overpainting on the sides. And so that's just another way of approaching how you conserve and show works in a gallery. Or you can do this great 3D imaging and get to look inside of an object to maybe even learn how it was made in a much better way than you could otherwise. And so my colleague from the BM, Dan Flynn, here is creating that. And if we go to this, there's a link, and we can, if we have time, we can come back and you can actually see the 3D imaging. I'm happy to share that. But what I'm very excited about, in the last part of this exhibition that I'll mention here, is that we're going to be supported by the Getty funds to also collaborate with our colleagues at the Balboa Art Conservation Center, which is our conservation department when it comes to paintings and works on paper, since we don't have a conservation department in the building. And so we together will be working on a selection of works. There are 3 here, one of which is actually a page from the Ajab al-Makhlulat, or the Wonders of Creation, in our collection from Yemen, I think it's 17th century, to look closely at these, to look closely at a selection of works from our collection including exams like infrared reflectography, UV light photography, X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy, it's called XRF. These are going to allow us to see some through the layers without being invasive. And it may give us a way of creating a project for the future to really delve into the whole collection of that came to us from Edwin Binney III and learn more about color and arts of the book and the workshop. So coming back to our original outline for this talk, we're now down to art commissions, which is going to be our last slide. And I didn't mention these two artists before, but I'm hoping that I can incorporate their work in two important parts of the exhibition. These are artists whose work is very research-based. They're both based in California. Each of them represents a different culture. One is somebody who fled Baghdad as a Kurdish Iraqi who then moved to Europe and then came to the US and is now based in Los Angeles. And the other who's Iranian American who grew up in Los Angeles and works kind of between San Francisco and the Middle East. And both of them engage Islamic discourses, whether they're texts or whether they're current issues. So, and I thought that it would be great to include them because they, for example, Kahraman's, this particular painting is it's called Curfew, but it's part of a series called How Iraqi Are You? And it explores the artist's multi-layered history of displacement and loss as a refugee who fled the first Gulf War, with a visual framework that's associated with medieval Arab book art. So people who know those would recognize that she's referencing this text, a very celebrated Arabic literary text. And so inspired by her research-based practice and her attention to issues of gender, narrative, and memory, and exile in diasporic cultures, I would love to commission her, if she were interested, to look at the text of Al-Ghazvini, The Wonders of Creation, and see would she like to create a dialogue with pages of the Al-Ghazvini text, and whichever one really moves her. And in the case of Ebtekar, his similarly research-based practice, it layers different materials, techniques, and traditions to explore scientific traditions that are associated with Islamic thought. And we're talking together about a project that might be something kind of similar along the lines of his 2019 series, which you see here, called 36 Views of the Moon, which was an installation that was composed of book pages, found book pages, printed book pages, that reference the moon over the last 1,000 years. And he did this in commemoration of 50 years of man walking on the moon. And each of these were then exposed. There are cyanotype exposures by moonlight of negatives that he got from the Lick Observatory in the San Francisco area. And there are 4 editions for each of the 4 seasons. But he also learned at the time, especially with the BLM movement, that he added to this other layer that is not just associated with his Iranian and Islamic heritage, but he included texts by local Bay Area poets and activists, in one of these versions at least, such as, I hope I'm not getting this wrong, such as Erica Huggins, who challenged the 2019 anniversary of the first man walking on the moon as distorting America's history of systemic racism. And she drew attention to this date as also marking 50 years since the Bay Area's United Front Against Fascism conference and the Third World Liberation Front student movement, the latter of which was actually what was the beginning of creating ethnic studies departments in universities across the country. So Kahraman and Ebtekar's works will become, if we are able and lucky enough to be able to commission and include them, will be complemented throughout the exhibition by that of other notable contemporary artists, such as, you saw Ahmad Matar's X-ray work before, Anila Qayyum Agha's, hers was that, this work over here, this cube in the middle that you see, and that actually addresses many interesting issues that I won't go into today. Ahmad Angawi, Kamal Bulata, and so on. And I was just going to say that, yeah, and referencing Islamic texts and visual traditions alongside issues of gender, identity, and cultural memory, these two artists, their engagement of both past and present makes them ideal contributors contributors for an SDMA generated project, but also part of a long-term strategy for us to build and continue to diversify our collection. And they could be presented in a gallery of contemporary art, a gallery of American art, as well as one addressing Islamic culture or Iran or wherever each artist has originated from. And so I think I will leave it. I think I've taken way too much time, but I'll hand it over to Q&A. Nobody stopped me, so I just kept going. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, thank you. This is really exciting. I can't even imagine how this will evolve by 2024. So it's exciting to be in at the beginning and to see what the thought process is going into this exhibit. We do have some questions, and I think, Ladan, first, thank you so much for sharing all of this. So what would you say is your biggest challenge with this project?
The biggest challenge I just see, actually, I feel so honored that another artist that I am hoping to include, he's just sent me a load of things that could be used in this. His name is Islamic World, so I'm very, very honored that I see this artist attending. I would say one of the biggest, and this kind of leads to this, one of the biggest challenges is that this is a very overwhelmingly wide scope that we're starting with. And one of the things that I like to do when I plan an exhibition is to always have a structure that can be malleable, because you never are going to get your ideal wish list. It's always going to be changing. Something will go, even something that's promised might later have to be taken away, or a pandemic could happen, you know. So I think the biggest challenge is in the process of doing research to keep chiseling, you know, keep chipping away to getting that really focused final narrative for the final version. And I think what's really going to help that is when we have our final list of loans, that's going to be our final object list for the whole show. That's really going to be when we can say, okay, so in this show, like maybe this particular science is not going to be that represented. But if it goes to another institution, it could be the place where that becomes, amplified. So I would say it's the scope that's the most challenging, and my not being a specialist in all of these different branches.
Okay. We had a question at the beginning where you showed the pictures of the pages from Wonders of Creation. And in it, there are some angels represented there. And the question was, isn't that prohibited in Islam?
So this will be the issue of whether figures are prohibited or not. And they actually not. There are hadith or traditions of the Prophet that speak against showing or against presenting images. But the truth of the matter is, if you look at the visual culture, if you look at history, and it will show you over time that images were constantly presented. Even when the Prophet went into the Kaaba and they destroyed the idols, there was an image of Mary, I believe, that was not destroyed. Now, I'm not the last expert on this, but and I can definitely refer anybody who wants to know more about it to it. We included this also, my colleague, Famida Suleiman, covered this very eloquently in our book that is accompanying the Islamic gallery at the British Museum. So I'm happy to sort of pass that on.
Great, thank you. So there's a lot of grants going into this PST, a lot of opportunities for people to present. Will you have an opportunity to, for all the, not just you, all the grantees to meet and share their findings as sort of a cross-cultural, cross-museum?
Absolutely, and I think we all met in the late fall or early, in December, I think it was. Yeah, mid-December we all met, but it was over Zoom, and then there were some breakout rooms. And they were just so short, those sessions. But right away, there were people that I knew that I wanted to talk to, and especially the person that I had spoken with a little bit at the Museum of Jurassic Technology, because all I could think of was this is great because they're not, I can get little examples of Muqarnas elements, to include, and then I can have photos. But we're a museum we're driven by the material, what we can show, what can be tangible and what we can show, rather than photos only, so how can we bring it to life? And I think, and one way of doing that is also to show the plans that they're going to be doing. And I said right away in that first meeting, like, if you guys have plans and we can exhibit one aspect of your plan, then that would also then tell people about what you're doing. And it just shows completely fits into the storyline.
Great. Well, you have certainly shown us the beginnings of life for this. And I also want to mention that the Balboa Art Conservation Center is very excited about their opportunities in this as well.
Oh, they're great. It's been great talking to them about it too. They really helped shape what we could do together.
Great. Well, thank you again so much. It's fascinating. We look forward to updates on this exhibit, and hopefully we'll be open by 2024. So
thank you. Thank you to everybody who came, and thank you to, I see a number of friends. So I'm very, very grateful to your coming.
Okay, thank you. So next, we have asked one of our docents, David Miles, who has a science background, to guide a tour through some of the works in our museum. And David Miles has he has a Ph.D. in molecular and cellular biology and a career in biotech. But more importantly, he is a person who holds our docent community together through his expertise and offers mentoring and training to all of us. So we're looking forward to David's tour coming up next. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to have the opportunity to present this talk after Dr. Akbarnia. I will go ahead and share my screen. Here we go. Great. And I'm, after hearing about how Dr. Akbarnia is organizing and planning this exhibition that will come a few years from now, I'd like to go back to our collection and items that she showed and a few others, and talk about how we perceiving wonders of science and art. The whole notion of wonders in some ways is, in the 21st century is we sometimes forget about wonders. It's easy to overlook wonders. And so I'd like to start off with an interesting illustration and quote to help us sort of frame how we go forward with spending time with these works. This is a chalk on paper drawing by Charles Lebrun from a little before 1690, and a quote from the writer Lawrence Weschler that I think really sums up how you might think about wonder. And Weschler talks about pillows of air moments. These are times when one can become so gobsmacked, so taken in and away by the object before one, this marble, that wonder, that one notices how, in astonishment, a pillow of air has formed and become lodged in one's very own mouth, and that one has neither breathed in nor out for what seems like a good 10-second eternity. I really like that. I'm sure you've had these experiences in travel or at a museum, for example, where you've walked up to something and made an observation. You perceived something in that time or place or moment, and realized that you've been sort of standing there without breathing for a moment to sort of capture that and experience that. It's a little difficult on Zoom to have that kind of experience, but let's see if we can actually talk through this together with some of these works of art. I'd like to start by introducing you to a figure from a golden age in Persian culture, around 1600, that is on display through a 20th century work of art. And this is a series of ceramic tiles that we have at the museum, portraying a court scene with dancing and feasting. And it's it's dizzying almost to spend any time with this, but it reveals a lot about what was happening around the period of around 1600, when many of these works that Dr. Akbarnia presented were being created. I'll get just a little bit closer in, and we can walk through this. First of all, just take a look at that border that is so elaborate. Every space is filled with this vegetal design, an attention to nature in a way that fills up every little bit of space. There's hardly, in this whole image, there's hardly any white space aside from people's faces and the floor, except for the carpeting. Even the walls are patterned. This goes to Islamic traditions related to trying to present ideas of the infinite. Again, always going back to spiritual ideas of the nature of God, if you will, being an infinite sort of entity. And so often you see patterns framing the works of art as we go along with this kind of elaborate design. But even within the figures here, we can learn a lot about what's going on in this court scene. There are dancers, there are musicians. I'm going to turn on my annotations, if you will. Let's just do this real quick. There we go. Right. So musicians playing, dancers, acrobats, courtiers. This is described as a court. The central figure here we recognize sitting on the carpet is Shah Abbas, and he's been identified here largely because of his presentation with this sort of wiry mustache. These tiles were actually created in the early 20th century, we think for a residence, and then were in Isfahan, which was the capital of the Persian Empire that Shah Abbas ruled over between the late 1500s and the early 1600s. This was a time of great expansion. He was a tremendously powerful and curious ruler of Persia, interested not only in preserving Persian culture, but learning about cultures from the Mediterranean region and from the Far East. Persia being right at the nexus of what we call the Silk Roads of trade between the Far East and the Mediterranean, it had an opportunity to share technologies, as we've heard about from Dr. Akbarnia again, that we'll address in just a moment. So this work came to us in sort of a novel, remarkable way. Initially, it was sold to the architects of the Chrysler Building in New York, but when it arrived, it was damaged. We can see a little bit of that damage here, and was returned back to the dealer. Later, it was sold to the philanthropist Doris Duke, who was building a home she would call Shangri-La in Honolulu, but Pearl Harbor got in the way. And the only good part of that was that it ended up back at a dealer here in La Jolla, and it actually came to live in be part of our museum collection. So this was a very lively period, very rich period of abundance. What would these people have done for entertainment? Well, we've seen some examples of that in one of the works that Dr. Akbarnia presented in terms of an illustrated manuscript. And let's go to, here we go. This is one of the manuscripts that Dr. Akbarnia presented that we have in our collection as part of the Benny collection. And what I want to focus on here isn't so much the illustration, which actually is a little unusual for these illustrations. Normally, these would be elaborately painted scenes, very detailed. Here, the artist has chosen only to give us a basic line drawing and allow us to use our imagination to fill in the colors and the scene of a man with his young daughter. But the artist has the page from a manuscript that would be more like a folio collection that tell a story, a particular story of a time and a place that would have been used for someone like Shah Abbas or another person of wealth and influence to actually entertain themselves and their guests. And the artist, having left the color out of the illustration itself, has brought color back in the border. And again, in the tradition, the Islamic tradition of elaborate detail, almost infinite kind of design, they've used a technique that in the 20th century, 21st century, is not so unusual for us. It's called marbling. I'm gonna, let's see, you've got a little close-up look of one of the marbling technique here. And these are what appear to be bands of color that have been shaped in sort of almost an infinite array of shapes and designs where each color remains distinct from the other. This is a marbling technique was developed through the recognition that pigments in solution could be dropped onto a surface of another solution like water in a way that they would not actually dissolve in the water, but would be kept in sort of remain distinct and separate from each other. You could then sprinkle, there's some great YouTube videos about this. If you look up paper marbling, you sprinkle these pigments in different colors onto the surface of water, and then using a simple tool of either stick or rake, you can swirl them around almost like the way a barista would circle the foam on top of your latte to get these designs on the surface of the water. And then the key is the careful application or laying down of a sheet of paper. Again, another technology that Persia got actually from East, and transferring exactly that pattern onto that sheet of paper in a completely unique, one-of-a-kind contact type of print. This technology was miraculous and incredible for the people of the time, and it's a tradition that's continued often. You'll find it in fine books or rare books in the library, or you may have in your own collection on the inside covers of books. But that's where I remember seeing it myself. Something that you might overlook, and this is the thing about perceiving wonder, is sometimes there are elements in our life that we might see, like inside a book, that it's helpful to sort of take a moment and to spend a little time wondering, how did they create this? It actually is a very ancient technique. So that was good for entertainment. And in a way, you might think of it as material sciences, the science of solutions and pigments in solutions compared with water. There's another science that Dr. Akbarnia mentioned in her talk, and that was the science of alchemy. Something that since ancient times, there's been a desire to find a way to take some common substance and turn it into something precious, notably something like lead into gold. And the Persians came about as close as you can possibly come to actually achieving that in lusterware. And we saw an example of this in Dr. Akbarnia's talk with this luster basin or charger actually from Spain around 1600. So this is a ceramic work. Ceramics themselves have sort of a magical quality when you think about the earth being fired and turned into something that's as solid as your coffee cup. But this was a ceramic where the design is a glaze that's applied, painted on the surface. And there's a little bit of a detail I can show here. Covering the surface, as you might expect in the tradition of Islamic art, and painted with a form of glaze that has a metal oxide in it, often silver, some oxide of silver or copper, that over the century, from about the 8th century on, they worked on this and worked on this and worked on this to refine the process so that they could actually end up with a color after a low temperature firing that was the result of a layer of something like, they estimate at 20th century analysis, I estimated it results in a layer of about 10 to 20 atoms of that metal oxide being left on the surface of the ceramic. That very obviously incredibly hard to imagine, wondrous thin layer of the metallic oxide reflects light in a color that resembles gold. So I would propose that this is one example where there is some alchemy going on. You can't collect it and turn it. It isn't actually gold itself, but it certainly has the appearance and presentation of gold, and would certainly have been valued by the people using it as something incredibly precious. Very popular, as Dr. Akbarnia mentioned, throughout beginning in around this time, towards a little bit before this, and it's continued to be used throughout other cultures. A lot of Art Nouveau type of glasswork, often you'll see kind of almost like a rainbow effect, almost that comes from the same kind of application technique of these metal oxides under low temperature firing, blending with just layering a very fine, it's a few atoms deep along the surface that reflects light in a particular color. In this case, gold color. So the Earth is a source of wondrous things, and sometimes it can be as simple as a rock, a particular kind of rock that is found in the Earth. And one of those has become treasured really around the world. This is an example from our museum of a piece of jade. It's shaped in this circular form. It's difficult to sort of completely appreciate this on Zoom, but it is about the size of that charger plate, fairly large. It's a very thin cut of the jade and shaped into this perfect circle with the inner circle cut out. You can see the nature of the jade that comes from how it's created deep in the earth over eons of time, when material, the earth is actually, pressures of the earth are compressing the material to the point that they crystallize into different types of minerals. Those minerals have distinct colors and properties. And it's those properties that I think we often, you may have actually experienced yourself when you touch jade. The feel of jade has an unusual touch for a rock. There's something about it that is different. There's a smoothness. There is a temperature, almost a sensation that you can feel that distinguishes jade from other stones. And this was appreciated not just in ancient China. This work, this disc actually comes from, we believe, around 3000 BCE. That's 5,000 years ago. But there are other examples of jade, this type of jade, typically called nephrite, from even the New World, from ancient cultures here in the Americas. What's especially wondrous about this is that jade is extremely hard. It's one of the harder stones that you can find. And this was shaped in this very thin fashion, ground into a circular shape, without metal tools. This was created before there were metal. There was really good metallurgy. So they very cleverly discovered that certain types of sand actually have a form of crystal that's even harder than jade. It turns out to be quartz, that they were able to use to abrade the rock, not cut really, but wear down the rock in a tedious, lengthy process to actually cut through large stones that might have fallen from mountaintops into rivers, into these remarkable shapes. It's a wondrous kind of thing when you stop to think about how old this is, how this was created, when it was created. And this object itself was found inside in a tomb in China, left there, we think, as a way of protecting the deceased as they transition from this life to the next. This tradition of the shape in China has been preserved over centuries and millennia, actually. Another example from the collection is one that's much smaller, but has decorated here with traditional design elements of a dragon and tiger And what I love about this work, this piece in particular, is that the artist was able to do this carving in a way that built the tiger and dragon elements out of darker portions, mineral portions of the jade, the piece of jade that's there, so that they stand out against the background of that lighter green. Just the skill and artistry of this is always astonishing to me. And this, of course, was done at a time when, by then, they did have metal tools, but it's still a very tedious, very careful process. So wonders of just the earth, of stones, and the way we perceive them through touch are contrasted, I think, with wonders of the heavens. And at our museum, we have a very unique work of art that actually represents the heaven itself. And that's this work, a wood panel covered in gold leaf, painted by the artist Giotto from around 1330, more or less. It's an unusual piece, just right off the bat, because it's triangular. And we've come to understand that, in fact, it was a remnant. It was a piece that was removed from an altar piece in the Church of Santa Croce, in a chapel of the Church of Santa Croce in Florence, Italy, probably around 1480s, when there was a renovation going on. But what's interesting about this work is how Giotto represents a key point of theology, to remind the followers of a key point of theology about the power of God the Father, who is represented in the center little window here. God the Father is identified here because he carries a sword. He has an open book with an alpha and omega, which is a reference to God the Father being here before the beginning, after the end, the alpha and omega being the first and last letter of the Greek alphabet. And he's holding a tree branch representing the tree of life from the Garden of Eden. And you can even see a little in this detail, a little bit of the fruits on the garden on the tree of life here. What's remarkable about this work, notable about this work, is Giotto's introduction of human form into this religious work. Leading up to this, in the style of painting for religious art, which was the central type of art made in Europe for centuries before this, was really more iconic, stylized form of figures that would relay specific types of individuals, angels, God the Father, etc. But here, he's actually begun to humanize them through shading, for example, and modeling of the form. You can see that in God the Father's face, his eyes. He's wearing this cap that somebody might have actually been wearing, really humanizing him, so that the viewer in the church would actually maybe have a little bit of connection with them, even though God the Father is incredibly powerful, right? In fact, so powerful that if we go and look at the angels that are trying to gaze up at him, they have to shield their eyes. So two of the angels on each side of God the Father are holding their hands over their eyes to shade their eyes, prevent them from being damaged by the glory, presumably, of this Christian icon of God the Father. But the middle angel on each side shields their eyes in a very interesting way. They are actually looking through what we believe was smoked glass. Now, it turns out that by this time, Europeans had understood that if there was a total eclipse of the sun, and there had been one, it turns out around 1330, a total eclipse that passed through Italy, that you could actually damage your eyes. In fact, one of Giotto's assistants was actually had this experience by spending too much time gazing directly at the sun, even during an eclipse. And so you could protect your eyes, they learned, and view at least a partial view of the power of the sun in an eclipse by looking through smoked glass. And here, the angel has adopted that technology of viewing something so brilliant and powerful as God the Father, to get at least just a little bit of a glimpse of that brilliance and glory through looking through the optics of looking through smoked glass. It's a wonderful example of how science was beginning to come into even religious art, and it was a way for the artist to use that as a way of promoting the theology or the doctrine of the power of God the Father. It must have been a wondrous thing to actually see this. I'd like to note that just to show you where how this panel actually fit in with the original altarpiece. The lower altarpiece is what is currently at the Church of Santa Croce in Florence, and you can see how our piece was removed from that and discarded. Another wonder of this piece is that it was lost from about the late 1480s into the early 20th century. It was discovered, as I understand it, by an art dealer at a Florentine art market who felt that it was remarkably like a work by Giotto, and come to find out it actually was. And then through wonderful, again, happenstance, it has come to be at our museum, one of the few works of art by Giotto in the Western Hemisphere. So we've seen examples of earthly wonders, of heavenly wonders, but sometimes we can find a wondrous experience even in something as simple as a peach. So this is a still life of peaches from our American collection by the artist who is seen, generally acknowledged as the first great still life American painter of still lifes, Raphael Peale. Raphael Peale was an accomplished artist in the early 19th century from a family of artists. His father actually was known as a great portraitist, and notably established what was recognized as one of the first museums in America. This is an insert is a bit of the painting by his father, Charles Wilson Peale, showing his sort of teasing people to come into his museum where they would see all kinds of wonders from around the world. Notably, they assembled the skeleton of a woolly mammoth there, one of the first examples of that in a modern American museum. It was quite wondrous. But let's come back to these simple peaches. When you look at this with the level of detail that he's provided, don't you sort of have a sense of the fuzziness of those peaches? The fact that he's presented them so naturally. There are even places where you can actually see the bruising on the fruit. This is such ripe fruit. You could almost imagine the flavor that and the juiciness of these peaches. That kind of experience can be also is another way to sort of appreciate the wonder of the work. Peale didn't just present realistic looking peaches, but he's presented this the bowl that they're in so remarkably. This is a bowl that has this beautiful lattice work that lets you actually see the peaches peeking through the bowl itself, and these grapes that are almost luminescent, so that they just come to life here on the panel. That kind of personal experience that we all have with produce like this are ways that artists can tap into creating wonder for us. Personal experiences certainly have an influence over artists as well, and the topics with which the ways that they present their art in the 20th century. So let's go to with a couple of work from the 20th century that help us appreciate that. Would you believe that this is actually a portrait, not just some kind of surreal, imaginary work of art by Diego Rivera? In fact, Rivera tells us that that's what this is. in the inscription at the bottom, where he says, actually lets us know that these are the hands of Dr. Clarence Moore of Los Angeles, California, who had the power over the tree of life to help it be refreshed and not die. And he describes this as a portrait by Diego Rivera in 1940. And we even have a photograph in the collection of Dr. Moore posing for this portrait and Diego Rivera painting his hands. What I love about this photograph is how Dr. Moore is sitting so casually with this one leg crossed over on his knee. And really the only part of Dr. Moore that Rivera is paying attention to are his hands. And this is a work that definitely, there are lots of elements here, especially the form of the tree itself and the use of that message along the bottom that are reminiscent of Rivera's wife, or at this moment in time, his ex-wife, Frida Kahlo, and who had, as a young woman, experienced a really horrific and tragic accident where her right leg was damaged so badly that it was misshapen, and she suffered really the rest of her life as a result of that accident. But Rivera understood that it was doctors and surgeons who had done a lot to help sort of revitalize her. And how could you, in a portrait like this, show the notion of returning something to life, refreshing a life to prevent death, better than showing cells dividing, which is what you're seeing in the top of the screen here. And here's a little bit of a detail that shows Dr. Moore's hands. And I think what's significant here when you see the detail of this is that the palette he uses for Dr. Moore's hands is essentially the same palette that's used for the tree of life itself, sort of furthering this notion that this is more than a tree. It's really representing, a person. And the way he's getting at this notion of refreshing life and restoring life with dividing cells, I think is just fantastic. I can't get over, as a cell biologist, how accurately he has presented cell division here. Cell division is a process that only happens when a mother cell is at a point of being its healthiest, very healthy. Everything that they need for life is there. And those are the moments that mother cells go through a remarkable process of dividing into two daughter cells. And we see that how that happens at a level of genetics, in fact, and genomic DNA. From the late 1800s, scientists had been observing under microscopes how these healthy mother cells went through a process where their genetic material would actually condense from being invisible in solution in the cell, condense into something that was viewable, duplicate itself visually, become two, and then develop these remarkable structures where on each side of the mother cell as it was dividing, a pole would form with these spindles that would connect to that genetic material and literally pull them off into the two daughter cells, one copy into each daughter cell. That daughter cell then becomes refreshed, itself can go through the same process and replicate itself. It's a remarkable process and a remarkable choice of Diego Rivera to use that knowledge of biology as a way of conveying the notion of Dr. Moore being able to refresh the tree of life or an individual, one of his patients, from being having risk of death to actually being vital and alive. Remarkable use of that imagery. By the mid 20th century, artists were very much involved in not just capturing portraits of patrons, but of making political statements. And Diego Rivera was certainly one of the most prominent in that sense, known for his mural work. One of the most famous installations that he created was in New York City for the Empire State Building, and not the Empire State Building, I'm sorry, for the Rockefeller Center, that featured a political figure that actually annoyed the patrons to the point that they actually destroyed the mural. One of the artists that helped him in that work was Ben Shahn. Ben Shahn is another painter who was very much concerned about politics and the impact of technology on modern life. And here is a painting by Shahn from the middle 50s, at a time when there was great concern in the world around nuclear proliferation. He, even as an artist, was serving on a committee that was writing about the dangers of nuclear proliferation. Certainly the United States and the Soviet Union, and later China, would all be engaged in a bit of an arms race that eventually, fortunately, we've been able to tone down a bit. But here Shahn is expressing his thoughts about and feelings about that, showing in this complex imagery that is at once figurative, with sort of a downturned face, arms that are coming to hands that are clasped together, a figure who is either praying or meditating, certainly, and thinking about technology and its impact on the world, illustrated by an emission of these structures that maybe he's referring to in the title, called helix and crystal. These little balls that are connected by lines that could represent all kinds of things. I can't help but remember that it was 1954 that the structures, one of the core structures of proteins was determined as a helix by Linus Pauling. And there are, on these little balls, it's a little difficult to see in this image, but on these little balls are letters that might represent, for instance, amino acids that make up the structure of proteins in these helical forms. A lot of work was being done creating crystal structures of proteins to help elucidate specifically the physical structure of these molecules. And so maybe that's a reference that he's talking about here, helix and crystal. But certainly he's really finding a very creative way to show how seriously humanity needs to think about and consider technology as it's being developed. I should note that Shahn was also an artist who, in 1957, was working in a style that, while not what you might describe as realism, still is figurative. And that's in contrast to what the dominant style of painting in the United States was at the time, that we would refer to as abstract expressionism. It was at the time, critics were really viewing abstract artists as being sort of the high point of American art traditions. And Shahn was one of the artists that was sort of bucking that tradition to pull figurative work and some elements of realism back into his work. So I'm going to just close with a reminder of how these artists that you can view at the museum have drawn on material science, on a little bit of alchemy, on optical, optics, and medicine and technology in their work as subject matter for consideration. And with that, I'll thank you all for joining us today. I hope you can join us again on other tours. We do have virtual tours throughout the week and month on different topics, and you can visit our website at sdmark.org and learn more about those. But thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Does anyone have any questions for David before we move on? Okay, well then I'll just turn it back over to B. Whoops.
Thank you.
Ladan has a question. Her hand is up. Ladan, you're muted.
Thank you so much, David. It's so nice for me to hear you talk about all these works. I mean, I knew some of the ones before that you had chosen, but to be able to actually learn so much about them is really great, because I feel like I'm also getting to know the collection more through your knowledge of it, and also through your take on it. When you were talking about the marbled paper, you're making me think of another loan that I might want to borrow from somewhere, because we're looking at how marbled paper has been used as borders and as linings inside. I forget there's a term for it in codicology, but there was a drawing exhibition that I did when I was at Harvard with another graduate student, and one of my favorite works was actually a piece that that we couldn't tell whether it was marble, whether the designs on it were drawn or whether they were created or inspired by the marbling. And we looked at it with the late Craig and Bowen, who was this fantastic conservator there, if Sarah Beasley is on there, she might know of her. But we couldn't tell the difference. And again, it's like
Oh, wow.
Sarah, who is at the BACC now as associate paper conservator, she might even know this work, but I don't know if you can see it.
Yeah.
Oh, no, you can't.
Yeah,
So,
Cool. Wow.
So here's a detail.
Wow.
This
Oh,
is the
wow.
pamphlet to the exhibition, which I'm happy to scan and share with anyone. But I think I said that I think it might have come out of the marbling, but to be honest, like it was hard to tell, and looking at it closely under microscope, we couldn't tell. But it's part of that whole. It's part of the experimentation and the wonder that comes through the drawing medium,
Right.
and why it's one of my favorite pieces ever. But the fact that something, did the marbling come first? Did the painting come? How did they draw this? You made me think of that, and the fact that we do actually have many works within this cultural framework that
Right.
are really where this is the centerpiece rather than the
frame. The border.
enhancer. Exactly.
Right.
Well, and as you know, with Indian painting, I mean, the borders are just incredible.
Yeah.
And that work reminds me of that maybe some inspiration comes from reflections in water. I mean, you sort of think about how reflections become these complex images
Absolutely.
that ultimately are based on reality, but on the real world, but it's in some other way. And I can't help think about just a shout out to our co-docent Renato Salazar, who has done some wonderful work
Really?
on paper with
Yeah.
that kind of reflections, trying to capture reflections. Cool, neat. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you, David. Thanks so much for sharing the wonder with us, which is, and it's just so fascinating, this intersection between art and science. We could just go on for days about this,
Right.
whether it's, Monet's difficulty.
Water lilies.
Yeah, exactly. Whether it was glaucoma, we don't know the diagnosis, but
Right.
Anyway, it's a fascinating subject, and thank you so much for covering this for us. It was wonderful to get
Thank
your
you.
perspective. And so to all of you, thank you for being here. We hope to see you at the next lecture, which will be March 19th at 10 a.m. with Brian Selznick, who will bring us the wonders of children's literature and children's illustration. Brian, actually, this is the fun part. He will be zooming in to us from Rome, Italy, where he is with his partner working on the Rome Prize. So he will have a lot to say. So he tells us that he's there in Rome, essentially all by himself. Everything is closed, but except the food is good. So my dears, goodbye. Until we can be together again, please continue to stay safe, wear your masks, wash your hands, and stay 6 feet apart. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.